The efficiency trap. Let's begin with business. It isn't our only time problem, and it isn't everyone's problem, but it's a uniquely vivid illustration of the effort we invest in fighting against our built in limitations, thanks to how normal it has become to feel as though you absolutely must do more than you can do. Business is a misnomer for this state of affairs, really, because certain forms of business can be delightful. Who wouldn't want to live in Busy Town, the setting of the iconic 1960s children's books by the American illustrator Richard Scarry? His grocer cats and firefighting pigs are certainly busy. Nobody in Busy Town is idle, or if there are, they are carefully hidden from view by the authorities, Pyongyang style. What they aren't, though, is overwhelmed. They exude the cheery self possession of cats and pigs who have plenty to do, but also every confidence that their tasks will fit snugly into the hours available, whereas we live with the constant anxiety of fearing or knowing for certain that ours don't, and that ours won't. Research shows that this feeling arises on every rung of the economic ladder. If you're working two minimum wage jobs to put food into your children's stomachs, there's a good chance you feel overstressed. But if you're better off, you find yourself feeling overstressed for reasons that seem to you no less compelling. Because you have a nicer house with higher mortgage payments, or because the demands of your interesting well paid job conflict with your longing to spend time with your aging parents, or to be more involved in your children's lives, or to dedicate your life to fighting climate change. As the Yale University law professor Daniel Markovits has shown, even the winners in our achievement obsessed culture, the ones who make it to the elite universities, then reap the highest salaries, find that their reward is the unending pressure to work with crossing intensity in order to maintain the income and status that have come to seem like prerequisites for the lives they want to lead. It's not just that this situation feels impossible in strictly logical terms, it really is impossible. It can be the case that you must do more than you can do. What notion can doesn't make any sense. If you truly don't have time for everything you want to do, or feel you ought to do, or that others are badgering you to do, then, well, you don't have time. No matter how grave the consequences of failing to do it all might prove to be. So, technically, it's irrational to feel troubled by an overwhelming to do list. You do what you can, you won't do what you can't, and the tyrannical inner voice insisting that you must do everything is simply mistaken. We rarely stop to consider things so rationally, though, because that would mean confronting the painful truth of our limitations. We would be forced to acknowledge that there are hard choices to be made, which balls to let drop, which people to disappoint, which cherished ambitions to abandon, which roles to fail at. Maybe you can't keep your current job while also seeing enough of your children. Maybe making sufficient time in the week for your creative calling means you never have an especially tidy home, or get quite as much exercise as you should, and so on. Instead, in an attempt to avoid these unpleasant truths, We deploy the strategy that dominates most conventional advice on how to deal with business. We tell ourselves we just have to find a way to do more. To try to address our business, you could say, by making ourselves busier still. Sisyphus inbox. This is a modern reaction to a modern problem, but it is not brand new. In 1908, the English writer Arnold Bennett published a short and grouchy book of advice, the title of which demonstrated that this anxious effort to fit more in was already afflicting his Edwardian world, how to live on 24 hours a day. Recently, in a daily organ, a battle raged around the question of whether a woman can exist nicely in the country on £85 a year. Bennett wrote, I have also seen an essay how to live on 8 shillings a week, but I have never seen an essay how to live on 24 hours a day. The joke, to spell it out, is how absurd it is that anyone should need such advice, since nobody has ever had more than 24 hours a day in which to live. Yet people did need it, to Bennett and his target audience. Suburban professionals commuting by tram and train to office jobs in England's increasingly prosperous cities. Time was starting to feel like a container too small for all it was required to hold. He was writing, he explained, for his companions in distress. There's that innumerable band of souls who are haunted, more or less painfully, by the feeling that the years slip by, and slip by, and slip by, that they have not yet been able to get their lives into proper working order. His blunt diagnosis was that most people wasted several hours each day, especially in the evenings. They told themselves they were tired when they could just easily pull up their socks and get on with all the life-enriching activities they claimed they never had time for. What I suggest, wrote Bennett, is that at 6 o'clock you look facts in the face and admit that you are not tired, because you're not, you know. As an alternative strategy, he suggests rising earlier instead. His book even contains instructions on how to brew your own tea, in case you're up before the servants. How to Live on 24 Hours a Day is a wonderfully stimulating book, full of practical suggestions that make it well worth reading today. But the whole thing rests on one extremely dubious assumption. Apart from the assumption that you have servants, I mean. Like virtually every time management expert was to come after him, Bennett implies that if you follow his advice, you get enough of the genuinely important things done to feel at peace with time. Fit a bit more activity into each day's container, he suggests, and you reach the serene and commanding status of finally having enough time. But that wasn't true in 1908, and it's even less true today. This was what I began to grasp in that park bench in Brooklyn, and I still think it's the single best antidote to the feeling of time pressure. A splendidly liberating first step on the path of embracing your limits. The problem with trying to make time for everything that feels important, or just for enough of what feels important, is that you definitely never will. The reason isn't that you haven't yet discovered the right time management tricks or applied sufficient effort, or that you need to start getting up earlier, or that you're generally useless. Is that the underlying assumption is unwarranted. There's no reason to believe you'll ever feel on top of things, to make time for everything that matters, simply by getting more done. For a start, what matters is subjective, so you've no grounds for assuming that there will be time for everything that you or your employer or your culture happens to deem important. But the other exasperating issue is that if you succeed in fitting more in, you find the goalposts start to shift. More things will begin to seem important, meaningful, or obligatory. Acquire a reputation for doing your work at amazing speed, and you'll be given more of it. Your boss isn't stupid. Why would she give the extra work to someone slower? Figure out how to spend enough time with your kids and at the office so you don't feel guilty about either. And you suddenly feel some new social pressure to spend more time exercising or to join the parent teacher association. Oh, and isn't it finally time you learn to meditate? Get around to launching the side business you dreamed of your years, and if it succeeds, it won't be long before you're no longer satisfied with keeping it small. The same goes for chores. In her book More Work from Other, the American historian Ruth Schwartz Cohen shows that when housewives first got access to labor saving devices like washing machines and vacuum cleaners, no time was saved at all, because society's standards of cleanliness simply rose to offset the benefits. Now that you could return each of your husband's shirts to a spotless condition after a single wear, it began to feel like you should to show how much you loved him. Work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. The English humorist and historian C. Northcote Parkinson wrote in 1945, coining what became known as Parkinson's Law. But it's not merely a joke. It doesn't apply only to work. It applies to everything that needs doing. In fact, it's the definition of what needs doing that expands to fill the time available. This whole painful irony is especially striking in the case of email, that ingenious 20th century invention whereby any random person on the planet can pester you at any time they like, and at almost no cost to themselves, by means of a digital window that sits inches from your nose or in your pocket throughout your working day, and often at weekends too. The input side of this arrangement, the number of emails that you could, in principle, receive is essentially infinite. But the output side, the number of messages you have time to read properly, reply to, or just make a considered decision to delete, is strictly finite. So getting better at processing your email is like getting faster and faster at climbing up an infinitely tall ladder. You feel more rust, but no matter how quickly you go, you never reach the top. In ancient Greek myth, the gods punished King Sisyphus for his arrogance by sentencing him to push an enormous boulder up a hill, only to see it roll back down again, an action he is condemned to repeat for all eternity. In the contemporary version, Sisyphus would empty his inbox, lean back, and take a deep breath before hearing a familiar ping. You have new messages. It gets worse, though, because there are the goalpost shifting effect kicks in. Every time you reply to an email, which itself may require another reply, and so on, until they hit that of the universe. At the same time, you become known as someone who responds promptly to email. So more people will consider it worth their while to message you to begin with. By contrast, consider it worth the negligent emailers frequently find that forgetting to reply ends up saving them time. People find alternative solutions to the problem they were nagging you to solve. On the looming crisis they were email about never materializes. So it's not simply that you never get through your email. It's that the process of getting through your email actually generates more email. The general principle in operation is one you might call the efficiency trap. Rendering yourself more efficient, either by implementing various productivity techniques or by driving yourself harder, when generally result in the feeling of having enough time. Because all else being equal, the demands will increase to offset any benefits. Far from getting things done, you'll be creating new things to do. For most of us, most of the time, it isn't feasible to avoid the efficiency trap altogether. After all, few of us are in a position not to attempt to get through our email, even if the consequence is that we receive more email. The same applies to life's other responsibilities too. We're often obliged to find ways to cram more into the same amount of time, even if we end up feeling busier as a result. Likewise, Schwartz Cohen's early 20th century housewives presumably felt that they couldn't defy the social pressure again towards even tidier and cleaner homes. So I don't mean to imply that once you grasp what's going on here, you magically never feel busy again. But the choice you can make is to stop believing you ever solve the challenge of business by cramming more in, because that just makes matters worse. And once you stop investing in the idea that you might one day achieve peace of mind that way, it becomes easier to find peace of mind in the present, in the midst of overwhelming demands, because you're no longer making your peace of mind dependent on dealing with all the demands. Once you stop believing that it might somehow be possible to avoid hard choices about time, it gets easier to make better ones. You begin to grasp that when there are too much to do, there will be. The only route to psychological freedom is to let go of the limit denying fantasy of getting it all done and instead to focus on doing few things that count. The bottomless bucket list. All this talk of inboxes and washing machines risks giving the impression that feeling overwhelmed is solely a matter of having too much to do at the office or around the house. But there's a deeper sense in which merely to be alive on the planet today is to be haunted by the feeling of having too much to do, whether or not you lead a busy life in any conventional sense. Think of it as existential overwhelm. The modern world provides an inexhaustible supply of things that seem worth doing. And so there arises an inevitable and unbridgeable gap between what you ideally like to do and what you actually can do. As the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa explains, pre-modern people are much troubled by such thoughts, partly because they believed in an afterlife. There was no particular pressure to get the most out of their limited time, because as far as they were concerned, it wasn't limited, and in any case, earthly life was but a relatively insignificant prelude to the most important part. They also tended to see the world as unchanging through history, or, in some cultures, as cycling repeatedly through the same predictable stages. It felt like an unknown quantity. You were content to play your role in the human drama, a role that countless thousands had played before you, and thousands more would play after your death, without any sense that you were missing out on the exciting new possibilities of your particular moment in history. In an unchanging or cyclical view of history, there never are any exciting new possibilities. But secular modernity changes all that. When people start believing in an afterlife, everything depends on making the most out of this life. And when people start believing in progress, in the idea that history is heading towards an ever more perfect future, they feel far more acutely the pain of their own little lifespan, which condemns them to missing out on almost all of that future. And so they try to quell their anxiety by cramming their lives with experience. In his translator's introduction to Roosevelt's Social Acceleration, Jonathan Churchill Mathis writes, the more we accelerate our abilities to go to different places, see new things, try new foods, embrace various forms of spirituality, learn new activities, share sensual pleasures with others, whether it be dancing or sex, experience different forms of arts, and so on, the less incongruence there is between the possibilities and experience we can realize in our own lifetimes, and the total array of possibilities available to human beings now and in the future. That is, the closer we come to having a truly fulfilled life, in the literal sense of one that is as filled full of experiences as it can possibly be. So the retiree taking exotic destinations off a bucket list, and the hedonist stuffing her weekends full of fun are arguably just as overwhelmed as the exhausted social worker or corporate lawyer. It's true that the things by which they're being overwhelmed are nominally more enjoyable. It's certainly nicer to have a long list of Greek islands left to visit than a long list of homeless families left to find housing for, or a huge stack of contracts left to proofread. But it remains the case that their fulfillment still seems to depend on their managing to do more than they can do. This helps explain why stuffing your life with pleasurable activities so often proves less satisfying than you expect. It's an attempt to devour the experiences the world has to offer, to feel like you've truly lived. But the world has an effectively infinite number of experiences to offer, so getting a handful of them under your belt brings you no closer to a sense of having feasted on life's possibilities. Instead, you find yourself pitched straight back into the efficiency trap. The more wonderful experiences you succeed in having, the more additional wonderful experiences you start to feel you could have or ought to have, on top of all those you've already had, with the result that the feeling of existential overwhelm gets worse. Perhaps it goes without saying that the internet makes this all much more agonizing because it promises to help you make better use of your time, while simultaneously exposing you to vastly more potential uses for your time, so that the very tool you're using to get most out of life makes you feel as though you're missing out on even more of it. Facebook, for example, is an extremely efficient way to stay informed about events you might like to attend. But it's also a guaranteed way to hear about more events you'd like to attend more than anyone possibly could attend. OkCupid is an efficient way of finding people to date, but also of being constantly reminded about all the other, potentially more alluring people you might be dating instead. Email is an unparalleled tool for responding rapidly to a large volume of messages. But then again, if it weren't for email, you wouldn't be receiving all those messages in the first place. The technologies we use to try to get on top of everything always fail us in the end because they increase the size of the everything of which we're trying to get on top.